Welcome to lesson 2, where we are going to talk about purees. And before I explain why I recommend starting with purees, I first want to talk about two skills that are totally outside the realm of feeding, because while they don't seem related, I think that they can help uncover some truths about purees. First, let's think about walking and how your baby makes his way to that developmental milestone. You could start holding your newborn and standing when he was a week old. You could begin to step his feet one after the other every day starting in the first week of life. But does this make sense? No. We all understand at some level that there's a developmental progression through that first year that builds up to walking. Whether you understand the biomechanics of it or not, you recognize that somehow rolling and sitting and crawling and standing come first, and you just sort of have faith that walking will come when baby's ready. When you see that your baby seems ready to work on walking, you offer your hands to help and you catch him if he falls. The other skill I want to touch on is riding a bike. I told you these two don't have much to do with feeding, but hang with me. Parents can use a few tools to help their children learn to master the complicated skill of riding a bike. You might use a tricycle to help your little one learn to pedal and to steer, or you might use one of those cool balance bikes to help your child practice steering and balancing. Or you might use training wheels to help your kiddo practice all three skills, but with an added measure of safety. So why professionally as an OT do I recommend starting your baby on pureed foods? Well, because eating table foods is a complicated set of skills, like walking or riding a bike. And purees are the first step of a developmental progression from an all-liquid diet to table foods. Simply put, they're easiest. They're closest in texture to the milk or formula your baby's used to. They can be safely managed with the same or similar mouth skills. They help you to break down the complicated skill of eating and to allow your baby to practice just a few pieces of that skill at a time. And ultimately, they provide an added measure of safety for a baby who's just learning to eat. There are certainly other approaches that offer solids as first foods, and some of those approaches are critical of purees and critical of spoon feeding. Those are simply not approaches that I take or recommend. I do respect every parent's right to decide what method feels best to them, but I do think it's valuable for parents to hear how feeding therapy professionals recommend feeding baby, and to factor that into their decisions about what path to take. That's a big part of why you're taking this course, right? If you follow the recommendations in this course for transitioning your baby from purees to table foods, you'll be relieved to know that they won't likely need to be on purees for long. And that's why I like to call my approach the fast track to solids. In the second part of this course, we're going to cover all the details of transitioning your baby beyond purees. But for now, let's stick with purees and let's look at how to choose which ones to start with. The first thing you'll probably consider without thinking too much about it is what the rest of your family eats. If you only feed your family organic food or a vegetarian diet, or maybe you mostly prepare foods of a certain ethnicity, those things will likely influence what sorts of foods you feed your baby, and that's just fine. Like many other areas of parenting, there are also some ongoing debates related to baby nutrition that might impact your food choices. So these might include whether or not you think babies should eat grains, whether or not you think beans and other legumes are too hard for babies to digest, if you think dairy is too inflammatory, and so on. I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not going to advise you on these topics individually, but I do encourage you to do a little research into any that you're interested in and find the decision that feels right for you. I am asked a lot about whether I recommend store-bought or homemade baby foods. And honestly, this is another one of those personal decisions that you really have to make based on your food preferences, your budget, and your time. Just know that you don't have to choose one way or the other. Both of my babies received both. My firstborn had more homemade foods because I had more time. My secondborn ate more store-bought foods. And we definitely use store-bought foods for convenience whenever we eat away from our home. So ultimately, find what works best for you. When you first start feeding your baby, the best practice is to choose single ingredient purees instead of blends of different foods. And the reason for this is really to monitor for any reactions your baby might have. It's important to know that the primary difference between stage 1 and stage 2 store-bought baby foods is that stage 2s will contain multiple foods but have the same pureed texture. Offer each single ingredient puree or stage 1 food for 3 to 4 days and just monitor your baby for reactions. These reactions might be signs of a true allergic response, like rashes or hives or swelling of the face, maybe vomiting or diarrhea, or even difficulty breathing. Those are life-threatening, those are dangerous. But those reactions might also just manifest as sensitivities or things to note and respond to, like maybe your baby gets constipated after feeding him bananas, or maybe he begins to have recurring ear infections when you introduce dairy. I've included a log in the printable field guide for you to print and use if you'd like. With everything else swimming around in my head as a new mom, I really found that logging foods like this was really helpful just in the beginning. So once you know that your little one didn't have a reaction to a particular food, then you can add that to his regular rotation of foods, and you can start to use it in combination with other foods. Let's take a look at an example. Let's say you've chosen pureed peas and pureed pears as your baby's first foods. On the first day, you're going to offer your baby, let's say, pureed pears. You try that for a few days and you don't notice a response, so you move on to pureed peas. Now you could offer those on their own or in combination with pureed pears, since we know pears isn't a reactive food. Any reaction you observe, you can assume probably came from those peas, the newest food added. After a few days with those two, you might add in a third food, let's say pureed spinach. You could again offer it in isolation or in any combination with the foods you know your baby hasn't reacted to in the past. After a few days of that, let's say you want to throw apples into the mix. You could take apples on their own and introduce them, or combine them with one or more of these foods, apples and spinach being the example here. One major worry for many parents is nutrition for their babies, rightly so. Again, I'm not a nutritionist, but from the resources that I've gathered throughout the years, it really seems like there are 2 nutrients to be particularly attentive to in your baby's diet before the age of 1, and those are iron and vitamin D. I've listed a few good sources of each here. Most commercially available baby cereals are iron fortified, meaning they have iron added to them, which is why they're frequently recommended as a first food for baby by, say, your child's doctor or your grandmother or someone like that. But there are certainly other choices available. Truthfully, I don't stress too much about these nutrients when it comes to baby's very first purees, since, as you'll see more in part 2, your baby will most likely just be taking little tastes of these first foods. These nutrients will become much more important after these first few weeks, when your baby starts to pick up steam and eat more. It is important for you to know that you need to avoid any added table salt or salty foods for babies, because even a small amount of salt can seriously affect the organ functions of your baby. And maybe you've heard to avoid honey until a year of age. The concern there is what's called botulism, and that's a bacteria that's particularly harmful for infants if they contract it. Other things to consider are allergens, and the most common ones are eggs, dairy, fish and shellfish, soy, and wheat. Research has really flip-flopped on this topic over recent years, so it gets really confusing for parents, but the current general consensus is that there is no reason to delay introducing these foods, and that there may be immunological benefits to introducing them early. Not before 4 months, but we weren't going to do that anyway, right? I'll share that I have celiac disease, which means that my kids are at an increased risk of having a reaction to gluten, which is a food protein. So I delayed gluten for 6 weeks, not to decrease that risk of my kids having the reaction, but instead to really establish a baseline of how their little systems were responding to food. Basically, I just wanted to see what their solid food poops were going to be like so I could see if gluten made a difference. You may want to adopt a similar strategy, and you may want to avoid the most common allergens I listed for the first few weeks, just so that you get a feeling for what's normal for your baby. I would definitely recommend introducing high allergen foods earlier in the day so that you can monitor your baby for a few hours before they sleep, and for times when you're at home, because no one wants to have to find an emergency room when they're on vacation. You may have heard, usually from a grandparent, that you should avoid starting your baby on fruits or sweet foods because this will lead to your baby preferring sweets. Well, here's the science. Your baby is already hardwired to prefer sweet long before his first taste of food. Bitter foods like broccoli and spinach and other veggies are biologically less desirable to your little one because they're lower energy foods. So you'll want to give your baby a variety of tastes throughout his early feeding experiences and when he's a toddler. and beyond even that. But he'll likely more readily accept those sweet or bland flavors as his first foods instead of bitter vegetables. And then you'll make it a priority to add in other flavors once he's really accepted those first tastes of foods and he's starting to get up some steam. Common first purees are carrots, sweet potatoes, apples, pears, avocados, bananas, butternut squash, and those fortified cereals that we've talked about. Putting all of this together, your key takeaways from this lesson are that I recommend a baby-led progression from purees to table foods, and I do that because it's what best matches your baby's development and his skills as a new feeder. And then your other takeaway is to begin with single ingredient purees with a sweet or bland flavor and offer each one for 3 to 4 days to monitor for a reaction. All right, on to lesson 3, where we'll figure out what gear we'll need for the feeding adventures ahead.